Hello, everyone. I am Heidi Lovejoy of Lovejoy and Languages, and we're here today to talk about imposter syndrome. Um, and what I really hope to accomplish today is to start a deeper conversation about why imposter syndrome is so prevalent among language learners, based on some observations I've made about how we approach and talk about languages. So, first, a bit about my personal, professional, and perfectionist lives. I am a US American born and raised in Kentucky, and my family and I have lived abroad now for about 6 years. I'm an adult language learner, and by that, I don't just mean that I'm an adult who learns languages, but more specifically, that I didn't start learning languages until I was an adult at age 33 when we moved to Italy. My main focus languages are Italian and German, which each began when we moved to the countries. We now live in Germany. In my professional life, I studied math and business at university, and I currently work in contracting, but I'm also the creator and host of Lovejoy and Languages, a podcast I started last year to talk about my language journey as an adult expat parent who has struggled with severe perfectionism. I've considered myself a perfectionist my entire life, but it wasn't until I started learning Italian when we moved to Italy that my perfectionism became a very serious problem that controlled everything I thought and did or didn't do, especially in languages. And for me, this ties into imposter syndrome. So, for example, when I started learning Italian, I told myself that I wanted to be fluent in 1 year with young kids, with graduate school, figuring out life in a new country, and having no idea how to learn languages. 1 year. So, this is a prime example of an exceedingly high and unrealistic goal brought on by perfectionism. And then when I didn't become fluent in a year, I felt like a failure and did a lot of avoiding of the language because I was heavily doubting myself and my abilities. I started to think that maybe I wasn't really a language learner after all and was probably lying to myself every time I believed I could actually do it and fraudulently leading others to think I was learning it as well. So then what happened when people started complimenting the progress I was making in the language? I thought they were just being nice. I clearly didn't deserve their praises. And if their compliments were sincere, then somehow I was tricking them into thinking that I could speak Italian. I was afraid that they'd start seeing me as something I'm not. Maybe they'd overestimate my abilities or start speaking faster, and it wouldn't take long for them to discover and know that I'm not legit. They'd know that I haven't been studying intensively like I thought language learners should do, that I hadn't been immersing myself at home like I thought language learners should do. And they're going to figure me out. And I have to say, I feel like a major imposter right now just being here talking to this audience. So before anyone figures me out, I'm just going to put it out there that I am a total fraud as a presenter because I really feel it very, very strong in this space. But we all know that imposter syndrome in language learning is totally normal, right? For one, we're literally learning new words by which to process the world around us, and it takes time for those words to actually feel authentic. Then there's the natural progress of language acquisition, where we understand faster than we can speak. So our level of speaking is way behind our reading, for example, leaving us feeling like something is off. If we learn in a formal setting like a classroom, then we're the students. We feel like students, not like someone who is skilled necessarily. If we self study, then we may lose that proof of progress and achievement that comes from teacher feedback or passing exams. If we don't live in a country where our language is spoken and we aren't immersed in it, then we lack that constant feedback that comes with using the language and hearing it around us. But then, if we are immersed in the country, surrounded by the language, we often feel like cultural outsiders. Maybe locals always switch to English or another shared language, so we don't solidify a personal connection with the language. And we grow a sense of imposterism, I'll call it, because we feel like we don't quite belong. So, because of the nature of language learning, it's absolutely normal to feel like an imposter. And we know this, we know that it's normal. But most of us experience some level of imposter syndrome in language learning because of these realities here. Consequently, if you've ever looked for advice on how to get over imposter syndrome in language learning, most of what's out there targets this right here. Things like setting achievable goals, tracking your progress, leveraging your strengths, stop overthinking. This is all good advice and it's certainly all useful, but in my experience, it's only useful for this sort of surface level imposter syndrome. for those imposter feelings that arise because language learning just is what it is. Theoretically, though, imposter syndrome should weaken as we improve or acquire more languages. But many still experience imposter syndrome in all of our languages, sometimes even growing stronger as we advance through the levels. Something about my imposter syndrome with respect to language learning is that I came into this language world as an adult. So, of course, I felt like an imposter from the beginning when there are so many others who've been here for decades. But I've learned that many of you who have been here for decades still experience imposter syndrome that doesn't necessarily go away with time. Because for many of us, imposter syndrome goes so much deeper than just languages. Personally, mine began in childhood, nearly 3 decades ago, from growing up in a highly critical and judgmental household and society that valued achievement yet didn't celebrate it, where gender stereotypes were largely prevalent, and with a parent who shut down new things by saying, "We aren't those kind of people." As in, we aren't the kind of people who do new things, go to university, travel the world, etc. I experienced imposter syndrome throughout school, university, graduate school, as a French horn player, as a basketball player, in my career, as a parent, in every single area I can think of. So, entering into language learning with imposter syndrome already so deeply and psychologically ingrained in me, like it is with so many others, telling me to just track my progress and change my mindset simply doesn't cut it. Mix that with perfectionism and reading over and over to set reasonable goals and leverage my strengths feels like a slap in the face because as a perfectionist, I haven't figured out how to do that in a way that's believable for me. And at the heart of imposter syndrome is confirmation bias. When we interpret what we see in our lives as confirmation of what we already believe. So, because I already believe I'm a fraud, undeserving of any praise because I haven't really achieved anything, then I'm going to see all the things in my life that confirm inability and lack of proficiency. Counseling can help many of us change the neural pathways and negative core beliefs of for those of us who experience imposter syndrome so deeply and in so many areas of our lives. And I'm not a therapist or a psychologist, but I do have things that have worked for me in dealing with imposter syndrome as a perfectionist language learner. And it all started with a realization that how I think and talk about languages and language learning affects how I feel about my legitimacy in language learning spaces. So I want to bring that awareness to the community in order to bridge the gap between seeing ourselves as imposters and reality. So, the first thing I want to connect to imposter syndrome is fluency. Like I said before, when I moved to Italy at age 33, I thought I would be fluent in Italian in 1 year. And when that didn't happen, imposter syndrome became very strong. It wasn't until I connected with the language learning community about 2 years into my journey and deep into imposter syndrome when I came across a podcast that talked about fluency in a questionable way. It was the first time I'd heard the term fluency not being used as sort of the gold standard of language acquisition. So the fact that being fluent isn't a concrete goal, it isn't a stable state where skills never falter, it isn't reached at a definitive point in time, and there's no universally agreed upon level or definition of fluency. These aren't new things, right? We already know these things in language learning. Yet, fluency and fluent still have meaningful places in language conversations. Fluency does generally imply that one can communicate in a language. It sums up our skills without having to give details like I speak, read, and write 3 languages at an advanced level, 2 more at intermediate, and another one that I can understand but can't speak very well, right? To just say fluent in 5 languages is a lot faster, especially when talking with non language learners who tend not to have such a deep understanding of how loaded the questions, are you fluent, and how many languages do you speak, are. Last summer, I went to Italy for a week with some friends. And at dinner one night, the server came and I've known her for years. So we started chatting in Italian about life in Germany, about my family, how much I miss Italy. And when she left the table, my non Italian speaking friend said, "Wow, so you're basically fluent now." And I immediately felt like a fraud. I hadn't done anything to try and make it look like I was something I wasn't. I just had a conversation with several mistakes, but the conversation moved forward with ease. So my friend just saw and heard a conversation in Italian with both parties clearly understanding each other. And this moment really stuck out to me because I had long since given up on fluency as a goal, instead, just focusing on improving my language. And when someone else called me fluent, I felt wrong. I felt like a fraud, and yet by no fault of my own. So, this instance revealed a gap between my definition or vision of fluency and what I know about my own language skills. And the characteristics I associate with someone who is fluent in a language were hard set in my mind long before I even started learning languages. I've always equated fluency with perfection, lack of mistakes. How can I be fluent in Italian if I don't get the right past participle of every single verb every single time? I picture someone fluent as being able to spontaneously talk about everything, but I still don't have the vocabulary to talk about social injustices or quantum physics. And I have yet to master things like subjunctive and all its uses. My lifelong image of fluency is confidently speaking at native like speed and understanding everything the other person says. But I have to slow down when my thoughts or sentences get too complex, often lacking confidence in the topics and grammar that I have mastered. And this disconnect between the implications and expectations I have about fluency leaves a gap big enough for imposter syndrome to grow. But in between my vision of what fluent means, of the characteristics I put on fluency, and my own skills, is reality. Even though we can't cohesively agree on exactly what fluency means or at what level it's reached, I think most of us would agree that it happens before C2 or native level, right? But that definition I have of fluency for myself really describes an extremely high language level more than it describes what fluency actually means to those who use the word. In reality, fluency has less to do with mistakes and more to do with effective communication, being able to navigate conversations and move them forward. I think we can all agree that fluency doesn't mean being able to talk about everything, but instead just a wide range of topics, at least the ones that matter in our lives. We don't have to perfectly use all grammar to be fluent. We can definitely agree that we don't even do this in our native languages. So, in reality, fluency is probably more equated with structuring our speech to be able to use the grammar we do know and be understood. And in this way, we can speak at a comfortable speed that we're confident with and follow conversations and arguments without getting lost in unfamiliar words. And confidence here too can be as basic as having the confidence to say, I don't know that word. What does it mean? Or being able to describe something that we don't know. And guess what? I can actually do all of these things in Italian. That's what my friend heard at the pizzeria that day. But this reality of fluency still isn't something we can pinpoint, right? It isn't an exact level and it isn't stable. Just because I meet each of these general criteria today doesn't mean I will tomorrow when I'm tired or stressed or just having one of those days where words elude me. And those days are the ones when confirmation bias takes over. And all I can see is a gap between my skills on those days and those difficult moments, and even the widely accepted characteristics of fluency. With relatively unquantifiable ideals, such as fluency being so prominent in conversations about languages, coupled with the fact that our abilities aren't stable, on bad days, confirmation bias tells us that we aren't doing it, that we aren't capable. I really feel like it is no wonder so many of us in the language learning community experience imposter syndrome. And that brings me to the second connection to imposter syndrome and how we talk about language learning, which is language learning labels. In addition to fluent, things like polyglot, multilingual, linguist, language learner, speaker of a certain language, or other titles that we take on with our jobs or language hobbies like teacher, coach, podcaster, content creator. When it comes to imposter syndrome, it helps to examine these labels, but not necessarily the words themselves. But we need to consider the expectations, stereotypes, biases, and characteristics that we associate with or hold regarding these labels. Just like the definition of fluency, the characteristics and expectations of the labels we take on or strive after aren't universal. They're very subjective, and they're the foundation of whether or not we believe we can use a label to describe ourselves. If there's a gap or disconnect between those expectations or characteristics and where we actually see ourselves or what we feel inside, then again, that gap starts to breed imposter syndrome. I'll give an example. Let's take the label language learner. It's easy. I learn languages, so I'm a language learner, right? But what other things do we associate with language learners? Maybe we expect them to study every day for a certain number of hours. Maybe we think a language learner should learn more than one language, should always stay committed to a language until a certain level, because otherwise they're just a language dabbler. Language learners need routine and long term goals. Maybe to some, it only feels legit if they're enrolled in a formal program. On social media, people often talk about being a serious language learner. What sets a serious language learner apart from just a standard language learner? Do I feel language learner enough if I don't make it a part of my identity and who I am and everything I do? What if I take a break when life gets busy? Some imply that this means I'm not a serious language learner, that if you want it bad enough, you'll find time always, no matter what. I could go on and on and on. So, what's happened in my story is that I think I'm a language learner and it feels right, but then something comes along that challenges this identity. Maybe it's just myself taking a break during a particularly busy period of life, or maybe I see a post on social media about being a serious language learner, or simply someone else sharing their study routine or habit tracker. They're clearly language learners, and I don't study like them. I don't have their goals or have time to study for hours. Then confirmation bias appears and reminds me that I knew I was too old. I didn't have the right kind of brain for this anyway. I just don't have what it takes. And I feel fraudulent calling myself a language learner. And this example of language learner label is rather simple because language learner is a broad term that I would dare say we all identify with. But what about labels like multilingual, polyglot, calling ourselves a speaker of a certain language or a teacher of a language that isn't our native one? On the surface, each of these labels seems pretty easy to define, and they help us put words to something that we do or feel. And labels as words can help us find and connect with like minded people who share our passions. But labels are more than just words we use to talk about ourselves. To use a label is to accept all the characteristics and expectations that we have of that label. And the stricter the definition, characteristics, or expectations, the more likely we are to experience imposter syndrome when confronted with that label. So, like fluency, labels can create a gap between the characteristics we see in our language lives and the underlying, often unspoken characteristics we believe define that label. And we don't feel like we measure up. We don't believe that we embody those characteristics. So being associated with that label in any way feels fraudulent. We feel like imposters just engaging in language learning spaces with others who call themselves language learners or polyglots or what have you. And again, somewhere in this gap is reality. I'll speak for the collective whole here when I say that realistically, a language learner is someone who learns one or more languages for any reason at all, whether for hobby or work or for a partner or for survival in a country, and with some focus on progression. The thing that really amplifies this disconnect between the particular characteristics we use to define labels and where we see ourselves is someone else who does embody them, right? So the disconnect here, where imposter syndrome implants itself and grows, lies between what I'm actually doing or not doing in my language life versus the expectations, characteristics, and stereotypes that I personally associate with any particular label. And those are things that other people are doing. And we just can't help but compare ourselves. Which brings me to the third area of language learning where imposter syndrome really creeps up: comparisons. Now, this one is a bit of a no brainer, right? It's really easy to feel like an imposter when we compare ourselves to others. Again, this isn't new information. We all know that comparison is the thief of joy and that we can't compare ourselves to others because we don't know their stories, we don't know their struggles, we all have different goals and preferences and so on. But that isn't incredibly useful when imposter syndrome has already set in and gone unchecked for years. And no matter how much we want to avoid making comparisons, we still do it. It would be great if we could just focus on ourselves and not think about what anyone else is achieving. But again, it's just human nature. It's our way of registering where we are in our journey and where we want to be. Making comparisons is one way we take stock of our personal inventories, the tools and methods we use in order to adjust for efficiency and effectiveness. And if we do look at others' journeys, it can be motivating to see others succeeding, to know that it's possible to get where they are simply because they're there. We see that it's possible. But in reality, this isn't how we use comparisons. Let's go back to my handy visual here. Down here is how I perceive myself. And this doesn't have to be negative things or weaknesses. It can be a very realistic representation of my language life and the things that affect it, such as a job or family. Maybe I'm still working on my second language, haven't mastered it to a high level yet. I didn't start learning until adulthood. Now, when I make comparisons to other language learners, who am I most likely to compare myself to? It's the people in the community whose faces I see most often, whose voices I hear most often. I look at people who seemingly have it all figured out, right? They already speak multiple languages, live their lives in multiple languages. They studied languages at university, have online courses, coaching programs, or they host events like this. And they're out there just soaking up all the languages left and right. And here I am, still chugging away at my intermediate Italian. And again, we know this isn't a fair comparison, but when we already feel like imposters, it's not easy to see those people at the top. Everyone else already doing what we want to do or going above and beyond our seemingly meager goals and not feel like we aren't even in the same category as them. Confirming those beliefs we already held about not being the kinds of people who can learn languages. When we forget that their accomplishments don't negate ours, don't diminish our journey or our hard work, especially if those big, huge things they're doing aren't even things that we're aspiring after, then we lose sight of that reality. And we leave too much room for feeling like we're not really doing this language learning thing. Like we aren't like those other people, those other language learners way up there. We clearly aren't like them at all. So we're frauds. And we do this. We compare ourselves with the most well known, highest, best of the best in other ways too. When we're at the lower levels, we focus on the higher levels where we aren't. Sometimes, even when those upper levels, like C2 or native like, aren't even our goals, but they're there, they exist, and we compare ourselves to that. As we learn grammar, it is far too easy to compare what we're now working on to what's still left to learn, the more advanced things that we know we can't yet do or maybe don't even know exist yet. When we focus on specific skills like reading or listening, we compare what we can currently do to something much higher, to ways of reading and listening that are currently far out of our reach. And even if we don't make these dramatic comparisons and have these thoughts often, we still open ourselves up to feeling imposterism. Our realities don't match up with some future version of ourselves that we may or may not even want to be. So, if we bring these three aspects of language learning together, fluency, labels, and comparisons, what is the common theme that I focused on today? The main thing that can bring out feelings of imposter syndrome. The gap through which imposter syndrome can start and or grow lies between how we perceive ourselves and how we each individually define fluency, labels, or some status out there. Even if our perception of ourselves is accurate, when we aren't degrading ourselves or minimizing our abilities, imposter syndrome can set in if our definitions and expectations of these are very high, very concrete in our minds, and placed in a category outside of what we believe is possible for ourselves. It's quite literally impossible for us to ever feel legitimate, real, or like we belong when our personal views of fluency, polyglot, language learner, and of the top most well-known language learners are so high and inflexible. Fluency can be a very reasonable word that allows us to talk about language use and ability without having to quantify or qualify our skills to everyone who asks, how many languages do you speak? We know fluency is possible because, well, we're fluent in our native languages. Others are fluent in our target languages. But because fluency isn't reached at a specific point in time and there isn't a universal definition of the word, we're left to determine our own definitions and our own standards for reaching fluency. And for many of us, that definition will formulate according to the strictest use of the word, especially if we're also perfectionists who struggle to accept the idea of good enough goals. Labels can help us find identity and describe ourselves. We can find community and connection through these identities. But these labels still come with implications and expectations. Our vision of what it really means to be a certain label, a certain type of person, is the foundation for whether or not we believe we can legitimately use a label. And again, those expectations are not universal. So we can easily start to question if we really measure up. And compound all of this with the fact that we can't help but make comparisons between ourselves and the best of the best, the others who meet our crazy high definition of fluency, comparisons to those who exhibit every characteristic we believe a language learner or polyglot should have. We compare what we can do to what we wish we could do, and where we are to where we aren't, to where we want to be in the future, and even to where we don't want to be just because others are there. So, right here at this junction of fluency, labels, and comparisons is the image of specific people who are fluent in our target languages, according to our definitions of fluent, polyglot, multilingual speaker of the language. These specific people embody all the characteristics of a fluent polyglot that we believe are concrete descriptors of what fluent and polyglot mean. At this intersection is all the other fluent polyglots or language learners who meet our strict definitions of the labels, who are setting the bar of expectations for being fluent or being a polyglot or whatever label or characteristic you have. And there are so many people whose lives and language levels we really don't even know, who we believe are inside this space where all the definitions and expectations come together. We believe that they meet our strict definition of fluency and that they are real language learners, serious language learners, because they study 5 languages every day for hours and they learn fast. They aren't afraid to speak. They are the real deal. And we're way out here studying one language for a few minutes a day as time permits, and we don't know all the words and all the grammar. We speak slow, we make mistakes. We aren't like those real language learners who do it all. So we can't be real. We don't measure up. We must be imposters. So, what can we do? What can we do when we come into language learning already feeling like an imposter? When imposter syndrome has existed for many years and the standard advice isn't enough. For me, I'm still struggling to figure this out myself. And of course, there isn't a one size fits all answer. But to get the conversation started, I think there are things that we can do or consider as individuals who experience imposter syndrome, as teachers or coaches of others who have imposter syndrome, and as a community where we engage with language learners from so many different backgrounds and who have such a variety of lived experiences. For each of these groups, I think one of the most valuable things we can do is be aware. Be aware that imposter syndrome isn't just comparing our bad days to others' good days. It can be more than just feeling uncomfortable with something new. Be aware that for many of us, imposter syndrome has a long history that can go really deep into our psychology. Awareness is very, very valuable. If you experience imposter syndrome, I also recommend being honest with yourself about it. Be honest with yourself when you feel it and see if you can identify what triggered feelings of being a fraud. This next one can be difficult, but try to practice falsification bias. This is the exact opposite of confirmation bias. I'll give you a quick example. When we make a mistake speaking a new language, confirmation bias tells us that we knew we couldn't do it anyway. The mistake magnifies the core belief that we aren't language learners. We aren't good at languages. But with falsification bias, we highlight the things that disprove those negative core beliefs. When you have a wonderful conversation where the other person understood you the entire time, instead of walking away and thinking nothing of it, remember that this conversation is proof against the core belief that you aren't doing it, or that you're a fraud. Next, I recommend connecting with others in the community. Connect with others who experience imposter syndrome, connect with those who share their struggles, and connect with those most well known language learners and polyglots too. And then listen, really listen when they tell you their stories of mistakes, of their embarrassing screw ups, of their failures, and their long language journeys. So we can start seeing them as humans too, instead of super learners who alone have the right to be called polyglot or language learner or whatever. And lastly, my favorite thing to practice is to use the words fluent and whatever labels you want, just use them. Not in a fake it till you make it kind of way, but I'm afraid of using words because I'm really afraid that someone else is going to call me out and just put me in my spot, in my really low down place. But I'm never going to be able to call myself fluent or multilingual or whatever if I don't give myself some exposure to the words. I have to start somewhere. And it can start with a qualifier like I'm conversationally fluent or I'm travel fluent, or even something like I can speak fluently about myself in the past and present tenses. Whatever you could say about yourself that you know is true, that you believe, using the words that feel fraudulent is an excellent step for letting go of those super high expectations and strict characteristics that underscore and define the words for us. In addition to awareness, teachers and coaches can support students with imposter syndrome by pointing out specific progress your students are making, share struggles that you had learning the language, and normalize the reality of fluency by sharing current accounts of your own mistakes, not knowing a word or not understanding someone else, because they still happen even at the advanced levels. And finally, all of us in the language learning community can start by being honest too. Be honest and transparent about our journeys, our study routines, our breaks, about everything. We can be supportive of each other without giving advice or tips or tricks. Every time someone struggles, we can just hold space for those down days. We can keep connecting with each other and listening to others' realities. And I always encourage people to open up about your own struggles. The more we share our stories of imposter syndrome or perfectionism or mental struggles, making mistakes or failing, even as we're going through them, the stronger we are individually and as a community. Because telling our stories helps break down the mental barriers to entry and the barriers to progression, and it helps us build belief in ourselves. So, with that, I will leave you all with my information and where you can find me. And then I will come over and see if there are questions. Okay. First question is from Anna or Anna. What top supporting beliefs for language learners would you recommend for our community to promote? I'm not sure I understand exactly. Top supporting beliefs. I'm going to come back to that one in just a minute, actually. I don't know if the moderator can do that, but I'm going to come back to that one because I need to think about that. I'm trying to think of like real beliefs that are legitimate. Let me come back to that one. From Marco, imposter syndrome affects us in all roles. Absolutely. I can't believe how good I am at my work, and it's all about imposter creeping into my brain. It really is, isn't it? Like the hardest thing about imposter syndrome is there's this reality that shows us that we're doing it. There's this reality that's showing us we're making good grades, we're having conversations, and then there's still this belief that we're not doing it. And that's where the confirmation bias and falsification bias really come in. We really have to be cognizant to choose what we're going to believe. Are we going to believe that the mistakes prove we're not doing it, or that the grade or the accolades at work and the compliments prove that we are doing it? Like that is a really, really, really hard struggle. Leonardo, do you think that the fact that we see errors as failures rather than opportunities to learn plays a role? 100%. This is, as a perfectionist, this one's really hard because for me, every mistake, especially in the beginning, I'm better about it now because I've really been trying to dig deep into my perfectionism, but every single mistake felt like a failure. Every time I messed up a word, it felt like I wasn't learning the language at all. And instead of actually digging into like, what does failure mean? I mean, we know in language learning, failure is not doing it, right? Like the only way to truly fail is to just stop. But it's really hard to whenever we have these really high expectations of being able to speak everything that we've learned, especially. I'm going to go back to honest question then. What top supporting beliefs for language learners would you recommend for our community to promote? The first one, okay, so the first one I can think of here is going back to fluency. And like I said, fluency it has a place. It is how we talk about the ability to speak a language. And there's so many conversations out there, so many podcasters and people promoting the idea that fluency isn't, a reachable goal. But a lot of times I still see those same people, especially on social media. I mean, that's what I'm going to call the language community for now, is just social media. I see those same people using it in just oh, I hope you all can't hear the wind there. Sorry. Using the word fluency and fluent in almost a flippant way, I would say, where like we shouldn't have to quantify or qualify fluency every time we talk about it. But it's just so prevalent that maybe talking more about abilities, like believing in our abilities more than fluency or even a level. I don't know if that really explains it, but that's what I'm thinking. Like I'm envisioning conversations happening where people aren't talking about I'm B1, I'm B2, I'm intermediate, advanced, I'm fluent, I'm not fluent. Envisioning conversations where language learners are talking about what they can do and what that looked like to get there. I mentioned the subjunctive being something that's really difficult for me in Italian, and I can see in my own brain this idea of not even knowing subjunctive existed to understanding it a little bit when I heard it or being able to recognize it, to being able to recognize when it should be used, to starting to use it properly in the present tense. And it's like these realities of what language learning really looks like. And this is over the course of 6 years, talking about these realities of this is what it looks like. I think these are beliefs that we can, realities that we can turn into beliefs, if that makes any sense at all. I don't know if that makes sense. In my head, it makes perfect sense, of course. But talking about the realities so that we can give each other that belief in themselves, that you don't have to do it the first time. You don't have to understand. It really does take a long time, but that we're still doing it. I'm going to keep thinking about this one. This is a really, really, really good question. Okay, where am I in the next questions? Joanne, how can you reconcile fighting imposter syndrome with an unwillingness to feel boastful or conceited? Oh man, I know exactly what you're talking about. I come from a very humble backgrounds, so this one that's also a challenge. I feel like for me, I've had to start with something that was believable, that wasn't at all related to language learning. So I have education in math. I have a graduate degree in math, for example. I call myself a mathematician. I don't have a job as a mathematician, but especially for many years, I was a stay-at-home mom. And in order to kind of explain myself better and what I do and all these parts of me, I started saying that I am a mathematician. And it kind of almost feels not correct because I don't work in math, but it was believable enough to me that I could use it without feeling like I needed to go ahead and quantify and qualify all of my qualifications or anything like that. So that's one thing I would recommend, is starting with something that is believable, maybe not even in language learning, and going with it. Or I think as people with imposter syndrome, we're less likely to feel boastful or conceited because we already feel like imposters. So this is one area of people that probably it's less likely, I think, maybe to really feel like we're being conceited. Leonardo, I've met people who were hesitant to join the Polyglot gathering who told me I am not a polyglot. I only speak 3 languages. This is exactly how I would react to that. I am here at the Polyglot gathering talking about imposter syndrome, and by no definition of the word polyglot am I a polyglot, right? My Italian is fluent. I mean, for all intents and purposes, I can speak Italian. I can have conversations, no problem. My German, I understand it. I speak it much lower, and I speak English. That's it. So that's first. There has been at least one speaker who wasn't a polyglot who got accepted to be a speaker and had people interested in her conversation. But polyglot, it's a loaded word, just like fluency. People can't decide if you need to know 3 languages or 4 or whatever. It's a space for learning languages, and the word is there to gather people who like languages, but really it's for language learners. And just continuing to be like, okay, but what does polyglot mean? Even polyglots can't agree on how many languages you need to speak to be a polyglot. So that's how I would address that. Okay, a couple more questions. Hopefully I can speak slow but fast enough to get through them. Supporting thoughts. Okay, use the terms confirmation bias and falsification bias, which I guess supporting beliefs and limiting beliefs. Okay, from Anna. Supporting thoughts. Supporting thoughts. That goes back to the previous question too, of not feeling like you're being conceited or something. That if we can just start with thoughts that really, really are believable to us. I learn languages. That's believable to me. Whether I learn them seriously or not, maybe that's a different story. So I have to start with I learn languages, or maybe I love languages. I am capable of speaking in the present tense in this language or whatever. Starting with those things that you really, really, really do believe and putting them out there, yeah, is a good place to start for supporting beliefs. Okay. Do you think, this is from Sophie, do you think a foreign accent can create an impression to be a fraud? From my perspective, as someone who listens to people speaking English with non-native accents often, from my perspective, I never think of other people as frauds. If you can communicate with me in my native language, then you're clearly not a fraud, in my opinion. But as people with accents, I think that it definitely can, especially in when you go, to live in the country and you have an accent. I think it can definitely boost the feeling of feeling like an imposter yourself, for sure. And but I also don't think that anyone should lose their accents. I love accents, and I'm a fan. So be who you are. I think that's most important. Probably the final question here. Having imposter syndrome, which comes to my brain from time to time, your talk really helps. Thank you. I'm so happy to hear comments like that. How do you go through bad days with imposter syndrome? Sometimes I just go back to something about myself that I can believe. I can believe that I, can speak Italian. I can believe that I am good at studying. I can believe something. And other days, I just have to take a break and just say, I'm not doing this day. I'm feeling so strongly like an imposter that I can't communicate. I can't do anything. And I just have to step back for a little bit and pick it right back up and pay attention. When I do pick it back up, pay attention to the positive things and the happy things that I know that I can do and celebrate. Another question from Vanessa. No. Yes. Nope. Back to Marco. Sorry. How do language proficiency tests fill in here? Do you think they may help? I have not taken a language proficiency test, so I don't know. I think it totally depends on the kind of person you are. If you think passing the test would help you to gain confidence in that, absolutely. If you're the kind of person who would need to get 100% on it to feel like it was legit, probably not the best idea. That is that's a hard one, because I feel like for me, I would love to pass a language exam, but I also know that for me, that might not be good enough to not feel like an imposter. Okay, one last question. I have 1 minute left. From Vanessa, what do you think is our responsibility as language enthusiasts to encourage those who are reluctant or even scared to join the community, polyglot gathering community, due to their concern of not meeting the criteria? Again, I'm not a polyglot by any means, but I'm here. I think just having the conversations and wanting to hear and share your own stories among the community, it is just tremendous. It's an amazing, and I know you guys all feel this way, but you know, no one's counting. No one's counting languages here. No one talks or asks each other exactly how many languages. There wasn't a test you had to take before getting in, and those things really mean something. They really, really mean something. That this community is very very accepting and welcoming, and we just all want to share languages. So that's all I have for today. I'm out of time. Please do not hesitate to reach out to me on any of my social media or listen to my show, reach out to me there. I would love to connect with every single one of you more and hear your experiences and your stories. So thank you. Thank you so much.